Hey there. Tonight we're exploring something that might hit closer to home than you'd expect. We're diving into the medieval world of taxation. A system so complex and ruthless, it would make the IRS look like your friendly neighborhood accountant. If you're enjoying these stories, I'd really appreciate a quick like or subscribe. It helps more than you know. Drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is there. Love seeing our little global community connect through these stories. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum. And let's ease into tonight's journey together. Congratulations. You've just woken up in the year 1347, and someone is pounding on your wooden door with the enthusiasm of a debt collector and the authority of armed law enforcement. Because that's exactly what they are. The sound echoes through your one-room hovel like thunder, and your stomach immediately drops. Not because you don't know who it is, but because you know exactly who it is. You stumble out of your straw bed, which doubles as home to approximately 47 different species of insects. And your first coherent thought isn't about breakfast or morning prayers. It's about money. Specifically, all the money you don't have and all the payments you can't make. Welcome to medieval Europe, where the taxman doesn't just want your money. He wants your chickens, your grain, to your labor, your daughter's marriage prospects, and if you die, your best cow. The pounding continues. Open up for the king's business. The voice belongs to the local bailiff, a man who was probably your neighbor until he got promoted to professional life ruiner. You know him. He knows you. He knows exactly how many chickens you own, which fields you work, how much grain you harvested, and whether your daughter is of marriageable age. Privacy is a luxury that won't be invented for about 600 years. You drag yourself to the door, and there he stands. The bailiff, flanked by two men with sticks who look like they've had their sense of humor surgically removed. In his hands, a scroll that's longer than your arm and contains more financial obligations than you could fulfill in 3 lifetimes. This isn't just a tax bill. This is a comprehensive audit of your entire existence, itemized and demanding immediate payment. Right then, he says, with the cheerfulness of a man who doesn't have to pay what he's collecting, let's start with the tallage. Shall we? You have no idea what a tallage is, but you're about to learn. It's a tax. They're all taxes. Everything is a tax. The good news is that medieval taxation is simpler than modern systems. Just kidding. That's a complete lie. Medieval taxation makes contemporary tax codes look like a children's picture book. You're about to discover that you owe money to at least 4 different authorities, in at least 7 different ways, payable in at least 9 different forms, due on at least 12 different dates throughout the year. Your village operates under what historians politely call the feudal system, but which you're beginning to understand is really just organized extortion with religious backing and legal documentation. You don't own your land. You don't own your house. You don't even own your chickens. Not really. Everything belongs to someone higher up the food chain, and everyone wants their cut. First, there's your lord. He owns the land you live on, the house you sleep in, and theoretically, he's decided you owe him rent, which is paid not in money, because money is scarce, but in labor. 3 days a week. You work his fields instead of your own. This is called corvée labor, though you call it the reason my own crops are dying while I harvest his. Then there's the church. God's representatives on earth have calculated that the Almighty requires exactly 10% of everything you produce. This tithe isn't optional. It's not a suggestion. It's a divine commandment with earthly enforcement. Your priest, who can't read but knows every tax law by heart, will personally inspect your harvest to ensure proper compliance. But wait, there's more? The king, that distant figure you've never seen, but whose authority permeates every aspect of your life, has decided he needs funding for his latest war. Castle renovation or wedding celebration. This requires a special tax called an aid, which sounds voluntary but absolutely isn't. Failure to contribute is considered treason, and treason has only one punishment. And then there are the local taxes. The village needs to maintain its roads, such as they are. That's pavage. The bridge over the stream requires repairs. That's pontage. The market needs supervision. That's stallage. The Lord's mill, which you're legally required to use for grinding your grain, charges a multure tax. Even the privilege of getting married requires a payment called merchet. You stand in your doorway, listening to this litany of financial obligations, and realize that you're not really a farmer or a craftsman or any kind of independent person. You're a walking, breathing tax revenue source, and your entire life is organized around generating payments for people who have never held a plow, planted a seed, or missed a meal. The bailiff is still talking, but you've stopped listening to the specific taxes and started doing the math. Your rough calculation suggests that between labor obligations, payment in kind, and actual money taxes, somewhere between 60 and 80% of everything you produce will go to someone else. This leaves you with just enough to survive, assuming you have a good harvest. Stay healthy, avoid accidents, and don't encounter any unexpected expenses. Now then, the bailiff continues. About your Heriot obligation. You learn that Heriot is the tax you pay when you die. Specifically, your family must surrender your best animal to the Lord as payment for the privilege of your having lived on his land. This means that when you finally escape this system through death, your survivors will be immediately impoverished by the cost of your departure. But perhaps the most insulting tax is the merchet, levied when your daughter marries. You must pay the Lord for permission to allow your child to leave his estate. This payment isn't based on your ability to pay or your daughter's wishes. It's based on the Lord's assessment of how much economic value he's losing when she moves away. As you listen to this comprehensive catalog of financial obligations, you begin to understand why medieval people age so rapidly. It's not just the poor nutrition, lack of medical care, and dangerous working conditions. It's the crushing psychological weight of knowing that no matter how hard you work, how carefully you save, or how much you sacrifice, you will never, ever get ahead. The taxation system is designed not to fund government services or infrastructure improvements, though those occasionally happen as side effects. It's designed to maintain a rigid social hierarchy where wealth flows consistently upward, from the people who produce everything to the people who own everything, ensuring that the producers remain producers and the owners remain owners. You realize that you're witnessing the foundational principle of medieval economics, systematic wealth extraction, disguised as legal obligation. This isn't taxation as you might understand it in a modern democracy, where citizens theoretically have some voice in how their money is spent. This is tribute, paid by the conquered to their conquerors, generation after generation. The bailiff finishes reading his scroll and looks at you expectantly. So, when can you have the first payment ready? You look at your empty grain sacks, your thin chickens, your patched clothes, and your calloused hands, and wonder how previous generations survived this system. The answer, you're beginning to suspect, is that many didn't. Medieval tax records are full of abandoned farms, fled peasants, and families that simply disappear from the documentation. For every person who managed to pay all their obligations and maintain their place in the system, others were crushed by it and vanished into historical obscurity. But today is not the day for philosophical reflections on economic injustice. Today is the day for figuring out how to produce money, goods, and services. You don't have to satisfy obligations you didn't choose to people you'll never meet. You nod to the bailiff, promise to have something ready soon, and watch him walk away to ruin someone else's morning. As you close your door, you understand that your day hasn't started with a wake-up call. It started with a reminder that in medieval Europe, you don't really own anything, including your own time, labor, or future. You're not a citizen. You're not even really a person in any legal sense that would be recognizable today. You're a taxpayer. And that, more than any other single factor, defines what your life will be like from this moment until the day you die, and your family pays their final tax for the privilege of burying you in ground that belongs to someone else. The bailiff has moved on to terrorize your neighbor. But your day is just beginning. Because, in medieval Europe, when one tax collector leaves, another is always waiting. And this next one doesn't just represent earthly authority. He represents the divine right to your grain, your livestock, your labor, and possibly your eternal soul. Meet Brother Benedict, the local priest who doubles as God's accountant. He's standing at your door now. But unlike the bailiff, he's not holding a scroll of temporal obligations. He's holding something far more terrifying: the moral authority of the Almighty, backed by the threat of eternal damnation and immediate excommunication. When Brother Benedict asks for your tithe, he's not just collecting taxes, he's collecting salvation insurance. The Lord requires his portion. Benedict says with the smile of a man who's never missed a meal while explaining why you should give up yours. The tithe, he explains, is not negotiable. It's not based on your ability to pay, your other obligations, or your family's needs. It's based on divine commandment, specifically interpreted as exactly 10% of everything you produce, grow, make, or find. You walk with Brother Benedict toward the massive stone building that dominates your village, the Tithe Barn. This isn't just a storage facility. It's a monument to systematic wealth extraction, a cathedral of agricultural tribute that holds more food than your entire community will eat this year. The barn is larger than most noble houses, built with stone that was quarried by unpaid labor, designed to last forever, because the church, unlike people, never dies and never stops collecting. Inside, you witness something that makes your stomach turn and your peasant brain compute some uncomfortable mathematics. Sacks of grain tower toward the ceiling like golden mountains. Barrels of ale line the walls in neat, endless rows. Wheels of cheese age on wooden shelves that stretch beyond what you can see in the dim light. Salt pork hangs from iron hooks like a meaty chandelier. This is the wealth of your community, the product of every family's labor, sitting in God's warehouse while children in the village go to bed hungry. Magnificent, isn't it? Brother Benedict says. Genuinely proud. The Lord provides. You want to point out that the Lord didn't actually provide any of this. Your neighbors provided it. They planted it, tended it, harvested it, and then handed it over while keeping barely enough to survive. But questioning the Church's interpretation of divine economics is not just heresy. It's a fast track to social ostracism, spiritual damnation, and possibly a very public burning. Brother Benedict walks you through the tithe calculation process, which is more complex than anything you learned in your 0 years of formal education. First, there's the grain tithe, 10% of your wheat, barley, oats, and rye. This is measured not by weight, but by volume, using the Church's own containers, which coincidentally seem to hold slightly more than the standard village measures. Then there's the livestock tithe, every 10th lamb, every 10th piglet, every 10th calf. If you only have 9 animals, congratulations, you're safe for now. But if you have 11, the church takes the best one, not the smallest or weakest. Quality control applies to God's portion. Next comes the milk tithe. Every 10th gallon of milk your cows produce belongs to the church. This requires daily measurement and record keeping. Because Brother Benedict has an excellent memory for numbers and a suspicious mind about peasant honesty, you realize that you're basically operating a dairy farm where the church owns 10% of every cow without feeding, housing, or caring for any of them. But the creativity doesn't stop with agricultural products. There's also the honey tithe from your beehives, the egg tithe from your chickens, and the fruit tithe from your apple trees. Even your garden vegetables are subject to church taxation. Those onions you're growing to make your grain porridge slightly less flavorless, the church wants every 10th onion. Brother Benedict explains the theological justification for this system with the enthusiasm of someone who's never had to choose between paying his tithe and feeding his children. Everything comes from God, he says. So, returning a portion to God is simply proper stewardship. You notice that God's earthly representatives live in stone houses with glass windows, while God's faithful peasants live in wooden hovels with cloth covering the openings. But pointing this out seems unwise. The most ingenious aspect of the tithe system is its moral enforcement mechanism. This isn't just about money or goods. It's about your immortal soul. Brother Benedict explains that failure to pay proper tithe doesn't just result in earthly punishment. It jeopardizes your eternal salvation. You're not just cheating the church. You're cheating God himself. And God keeps excellent records. Consider the story of Ananias and Sapphira. Brother Benedict says, referencing the biblical couple who were struck dead for withholding money from the apostles, "The Lord sees all, knows all, and judges all." Your tithe is your spiritual offering, your demonstration of faith, your investment in eternal life. This creates a psychological torture that goes far beyond simple taxation. Every grain of wheat you keep for your family instead of giving to the church becomes a potential sin. Every egg you feed to your malnourished children instead of delivering to Brother Benedict becomes a mark against your soul. The church has weaponized guilt, turning basic survival instincts into moral failings. But the tithe is just the beginning of the church's financial relationship with your community. There are also the special collections. When the bishop visits, everyone contributes to his traveling expenses. When a new cathedral is being built somewhere you'll never see, everyone contributes to the construction fund. When the Pope calls for a crusade against distant enemies you've never heard of, everyone contributes to the war effort. Then there are the sacramental fees. Want your baby baptized? That costs money. Need to get married? More money. Someone in your family dying and you want a proper funeral mass? Even more money. The church has managed to monetize every major life event, turning birth, marriage, and death into revenue opportunities. The most profitable innovation is the indulgence system, which Brother Benedict explains with the excitement of a salesman describing a limited-time offer. For the right price, you can purchase forgiveness for sins not yet committed. For a larger payment, you can reduce your time in purgatory. For an even bigger contribution, you can buy spiritual benefits for your dead relatives, who are presumably suffering in the afterlife until you pay their supernatural bail. Think of your dear departed grandmother. Brother Benedict says with practiced sympathy, she's in purgatory right now, suffering for her earthly sins. But for just the cost of 2 sheep, you can reduce her suffering by 100 years. Can you really put a price on grandmother's eternal comfort? This system is so psychologically effective that families bankrupt themselves buying spiritual services for people who are already dead. The church has created a celestial economy where earthly wealth can purchase heavenly benefits. and the exchange rate is always in the church's favor. You learn that the local monastery, which sits on the hill overlooking your village like a feudal castle, is actually wealthier than most feudal castles. The monks, who took vows of poverty, collectively own more land than the local lord. They receive tithes from dozens of villages, collect rent from hundreds of tenant farmers, and operate what amounts to a religious corporation with tax-exempt status and divine endorsement. The irony is not lost on you that these men who swore to reject worldly wealth have created the most efficient wealth accumulation system in Europe. They don't own anything personally, but their institution owns everything permanently. When a monk dies, his wealth stays with the monastery. When you die, your wealth gets divided among heirs who immediately owe inheritance taxes to multiple authorities. The church wins by never dying. Brother Benedict shows you the monastery's ledger books, thick volumes bound in leather and filled with neat handwriting that records every payment, every obligation, every debt owed by every family in the region. These aren't just financial records. They're instruments of social control. The monastery knows exactly how much everyone produces, what they owe, when they paid last, and what they can afford to pay next. We keep careful records. Brother Benedict says, because accountability is a Christian virtue. You realize that the church has basically invented comprehensive economic surveillance, tracking the financial activity of entire populations for the stated purpose of spiritual guidance and the obvious purpose of maximum revenue extraction. As the day wears on and you watch cart after cart of your community's produce disappear into the tithe barn, you understand that this system represents something more sophisticated and more oppressive than simple taxation. It's the conversion of religious devotion into economic exploitation, the transformation of spiritual obligation into material tribute. The church has solved the fundamental problem of all taxation systems: how to make people pay without using obvious force. Instead of relying on bailiffs with sticks, the church uses guilt, fear, and social pressure. Instead of threatening earthly punishment, they threaten eternal damnation. Instead of taking your money, they convince you to give it voluntarily as an act of faith. Brother Benedict concludes your education in ecclesiastical economics with a final observation that perfectly captures the beauty of the system from the church's perspective. Remember, he says, the tithe is not just about this life. It's an investment in the next life. And unlike earthly investments, spiritual investments never lose their value. As you walk home from the tithe barn, passing through a village where every family has just surrendered 10% of their yearly production to an institution that produces nothing but spiritual services, you begin to understand why medieval Europe developed such a complex relationship with religion. Faith isn't just about personal belief. It's about participation in an economic system that uses divine authority to justify wealth transfer on an unprecedented scale. Tonight, you'll go to bed in a house that's colder and emptier because of the tithe system. But according to Brother Benedict, you'll wake up tomorrow with a soul that's cleaner and a place in heaven that's more secure. Whether that trade is worth it depends entirely on how much you trust God's earthly accountants to manage both your temporal and eternal finances. And tomorrow, there will be other taxes, other collectors, and other justifications for why the people who work should give their production to the people who own. The tithe barn stands as a monument not just to religious devotion, but to the medieval genius for turning every human relationship into a financial obligation. You thought the church was thorough in its taxation methods. You thought your local lord was creative in finding ways to separate you from your property. But now you're about to meet the apex predator of medieval revenue collection, the royal tax system. This isn't just about taking your money. This is about taking your money with the efficiency of a military operation and the legitimacy of divine right. The royal messenger arrives on horseback, which immediately tells you this is serious. Horses cost money. Messages delivered on foot are for local annoyances. Messages delivered on horseback are for kingdom-threatening emergencies that somehow require your immediate financial participation. The messenger dismounts, unrolls a scroll that bears the royal seal, and begins reading in the kind of voice reserved for pronouncements that will ruin your entire year. By order of His Royal Majesty, the messenger begins. All subjects are hereby commanded to render aid for the defense of the realm. The marriage of the king's daughter, the ransom of the king's brother, and the construction of fortifications necessary for the security of the kingdom. You count 4 separate financial emergencies in one sentence, which seems mathematically improbable but politically predictable. This is how you discover scutage, the tax that revolutionized medieval warfare by making it optional for the rich and mandatory for the poor. Traditionally, holding land meant you owed military service. 40 days a year. You grabbed a weapon and followed your lord into whatever conflict had captured the royal imagination. But now there's an alternative. Instead of risking your life in battle, you can simply pay the equivalent value in money. This sounds reasonable until you realize what it actually means. Wealthy landowners can buy their way out of military service, while poor farmers who can't afford the payment are still conscripted into armies. The royal tax system has managed to create a situation where the people with the most to lose from war are the least likely to fight it, while the people with nothing to gain are the most likely to die for it. The messenger continues reading. The king requires an aid for his daughter's wedding. This isn't a voluntary contribution to help with catering costs. This is a mandatory tax levied on the entire kingdom to fund a royal celebration that will cost more than most villages produce in a decade. You'll be paying for silk dresses, imported wine, golden jewelry, and entertainment by professional musicians, none of which you'll ever see, hear, or benefit from. But the creativity of royal taxation really shines in the category of emergency levies. The king's brother has been captured in a foreign war and requires ransom. This creates a tax called an aid, which sounds voluntary but carries the implicit threat that subjects who fail to contribute adequately might find themselves questioned about their loyalty to the crown. Treason accusations have a way of solving royal budget problems while eliminating political opposition. Then there's the royal prerogative of purveyance, which is theft disguised as commerce. Royal agents appear at your farm with a document that authorizes them to purchase your goods at prices they set. Whether you want to sell or not, they take your best chickens, your finest grain, your strongest horses, and pay you approximately half of what these items would fetch at market. This isn't taxation. This is legalized robbery with paperwork. The messenger explains that purveyance serves the important function of supplying royal households as they travel throughout the kingdom. When the king decides to visit a region, local communities are required to provide food, lodging, transportation, and entertainment at below-market prices. It's like being forced to host a massive, expensive party for people who will never reciprocate, then being charged for the privilege. But perhaps the most insidious royal tax is the forest law, which transforms poaching into a revenue stream. The king declares vast areas of countryside to be royal forest, regardless of who previously used these lands for hunting, gathering, or grazing. Suddenly, activities that were normal and legal become crimes punishable by fines, imprisonment, or death. You learn that catching a rabbit on what was yesterday your own land, but is today royal forest can result in a fine equivalent to several months of labor. Gathering firewood in areas where your grandfather collected fuel for decades now requires royal permission and substantial payment. Even walking through certain forests without authorization becomes a criminal act with financial penalties. The forest law creates a particularly elegant taxation mechanism because it criminalizes subsistence activities that poor people can't avoid. You need fuel for heating and cooking. You need occasional meat protein. You need grazing areas for livestock. The royal forest system ensures that meeting these basic needs requires either paying taxes or risking legal punishment that results in paying even larger taxes. Your education in royal revenue generation continues with an explanation of tallage, the tax that perfectly embodies royal logic about property rights. Tallage is levied when the king decides he needs money, which happens with suspicious frequency. The amount isn't based on your ability to pay, your previous contributions, or any calculation of fair burden sharing. It's based on royal assessment of how much can be extracted without triggering open rebellion. Tallage collection reveals the fundamental relationship between subjects and crown in medieval Europe. You don't own property. You hold property at royal pleasure. Subject to royal needs. Revocable by royal decision. When the king levies tallage, he's not asking for your money. He's taking his money that he allowed you to hold temporarily for your own use. The messenger describes the newest innovation in royal taxation, the wardrobe tax. This levy funds the royal household's clothing expenses, ensuring that the king, queen, and their extensive family maintain appearances appropriate to their divine status. You'll be contributing to purchase silk imported from Asia, furs transported from northern forests, gold thread woven by master craftsmen, and jewelry designed by artists whose annual income exceeds your village's collective wealth. But the royal tax system's masterpiece is the marriage tax levied on noble families. When aristocratic children reach marriageable age, their parents must pay the crown for permission to arrange marriages. This isn't just revenue generation, it's social control. The king can approve marriages that serve royal interests, reject matches that threaten royal authority, and extract substantial payments for the privilege of family planning. This system extends royal power deep into private life while generating enormous income. Wealthy families, desperate to secure advantageous marriages for their children, bid against each other, driving up prices for royal approval. The crown profits from both successful matches, which require payment, and rejected proposals, which often result in larger payments to overcome initial refusal. You're beginning to understand that royal taxation represents something qualitatively different from local taxes or church tithes. This is systematic economic control designed to maintain political hierarchy. Every tax serves dual purposes, generating revenue for royal expenses and reinforcing royal authority over subjects' lives, property, and decisions. The messenger mentions almost casually that royal tax collection is administered through a system called tax farming. Instead of employing salaried collectors, the crown auctions collection rights to private individuals who bid on the privilege of extracting taxes from specific regions. These tax farmers pay the crown a guaranteed amount up front, then keep whatever they can collect above that amount. This creates powerful incentives for aggressive collection methods. Tax farmers who paid substantial sums for collection rights need to extract enough additional revenue to cover their investment and generate profit. Communities aren't just dealing with royal tax obligations. They're dealing with private entrepreneurs who have financial motivation to maximize extraction through whatever methods prove effective. The tax farming system transforms royal revenue collection into a business opportunity for wealthy individuals who can afford the upfront investment. These tax farmers often use techniques that royal officials might consider too harsh. But since they're operating as private contractors rather than direct royal agents, the crown maintains plausible deniability about collection methods. Your conversation with the royal messenger concludes with perhaps the most revealing aspect of the entire system, the royal pardon process. If you're accused of tax evasion, treason, or other crimes against royal authority, you can purchase forgiveness through substantial payments to the crown. Justice becomes a commodity sold at prices determined by royal financial needs rather than legal principles. This creates a parallel legal system where wealthy individuals can essentially purchase immunity from consequences, while poor people face full punishment for identical actions. The royal tax system hasn't just created economic inequality. It's created legal inequality where justice depends on ability to pay rather than guilt or innocence. As the messenger rides away to deliver similar financial obligations to your neighbors, you contemplate what you've learned about royal taxation. This isn't just about funding government operations or public services, though those occasionally happen as side effects. This is about maintaining a system where wealth flows consistently upward to support royal lifestyle and royal power. The royal tax machine operates with mechanical efficiency. Every aspect of economic life becomes taxable. Every human relationship creates revenue opportunities. Every basic need transforms into a source of royal income. You're not a citizen participating in governance through taxation. You're raw material being processed by a revenue extraction system that views your productivity as royal property. Tonight, you'll calculate your royal tax obligations alongside your local taxes and church tithes. The mathematics are depressing but educational. Between military payments, emergency aids, forest fines, marriage taxes, and various fees for royal permissions, you're discovering that medieval taxation makes contemporary tax codes look simple and contemporary tax rates look generous. Tomorrow, there will be other royal messengers with other royal needs requiring other financial contributions. The royal tax machine never sleeps, never stops, and never considers whether subjects can actually afford what's being demanded. It simply operates according to the fundamental principle of medieval governance. Everything belongs to the king, and subjects exist to provide revenue for royal purposes. Welcome to taxation without representation, where your only political rights are the right to pay and the right to pay more. You thought rural taxation was complicated. You thought feudal obligations were creative. But now you're about to discover what happens when medieval tax systems encounter commerce, trade, and the revolutionary concept of people actually making money instead of just growing food and raising livestock. Welcome to the medieval town, where taxation becomes an art form practiced by multiple competing authorities who all want a piece of your increasingly complex economic life. You've decided to leave your lord's estate and try your luck in the nearest town. This seems like a brilliant plan until you approach the town gates and encounter your first urban tax, the murage. Before you can even enter this supposed refuge from feudal oppression, you must pay a toll to contribute to the town's wall construction and maintenance. The irony is immediate and crushing. You're paying for the privilege of entering a place where you'll pay many additional taxes for the privilege of living there. The gatekeeper, a man whose job description apparently includes professional discourager of newcomers, explains that the murage is calculated based on what you're bringing into town. Your cart, your horse, your tools, your personal belongings, even your clothing, all assessed and taxed before you can proceed. It's like paying admission to a very expensive show where the entertainment consists of watching your money disappear. But the murage is just the appetizer in the feast of urban taxation that awaits you. Once inside the town walls, you discover that every street, every market square, every bridge, and every public space operates as a separate revenue generation zone with its own unique taxation system. First, there's pavage, the tax for road maintenance. Every town street requires constant repair because medieval road construction consists primarily of wishful thinking and mud. The pavage tax is levied on everyone who uses the roads, which means everyone, calculated according to how much wear and tear your activities supposedly create. Walking generates a small pavage obligation. Riding a horse creates a larger one. Operating a cart requires substantial pavage payments. Simply existing in a town with roads makes you complicit in their deterioration and financially responsible for their upkeep. Then you encounter pontage, the bridge tax that applies every time you cross any bridge within the town boundaries. Towns love bridges because bridges create natural bottlenecks where tax collection becomes unavoidable. You can't sneak across a bridge or find alternative routes through someone else's property. Bridges force you to encounter tax collectors who have all day to calculate exactly how much your crossing should cost based on what you're carrying, where you're going, and how prosperous you appear. The pontage system creates particularly creative revenue opportunities because tax collectors can adjust rates based on market conditions, seasonal demand, and their assessment of individual ability to pay. Crossing the bridge during market day costs more than crossing on quiet days. Merchants carrying valuable goods pay higher pontage than farmers carrying vegetables. Even the same person pays different amounts depending on whether the tax collector thinks they've had a good week or a bad week. Your education in urban taxation accelerates when you visit the market square. That bustling center of commerce where every transaction generates multiple tax obligations. There's stallage, the tax for occupying space in the market. This isn't rent in any modern sense. It's a daily fee calculated by the size of your market presence, the value of goods you're selling, and the tax collector's mood. But stallage is just the beginning. There's also a transaction tax on every sale, a commodity tax based on what type of goods you're trading, and a measurement tax if your business involves weighing or measuring products for customers. The medieval market operates like a casino where the house takes a cut of every bet. Except the house is the town government, and every commercial activity is a bet against your ability to maintain profitability under comprehensive taxation. You quickly learn that market taxation creates a complex ecosystem of avoidance strategies and enforcement responses. Merchants develop elaborate schemes to minimize their apparent transaction volume. Tax collectors develop equally elaborate schemes to detect and punish tax avoidance. The result is a constant low-level war between people trying to make money and authorities trying to take money, fought daily in every market square across Europe. The most ingenious urban tax is probably the chimney tax, which demonstrates how medieval administrators could find revenue opportunities in literally anything. Every building with a chimney owes annual payments calculated by the number of chimneys, their size, their construction materials, and their usage patterns. This creates incentives for bizarre architectural choices, where buildings are designed primarily to minimize tax obligations rather than maximize functionality or comfort. The chimney tax spawns an entire subsidiary industry of tax assessors who specialize in chimney evaluation. These experts can determine from external observation how many fireplaces a building contains, what type of fuel is being burned, and approximately how much cooking and heating activity is occurring inside. Privacy becomes impossible when your tax obligations depend on assessors' ability to monitor your domestic activities through architectural analysis. But perhaps the most psychologically oppressive urban tax is the guild system, which transforms professional regulation into comprehensive economic control. Every craft, every trade, every commercial activity in town requires guild membership. Guilds ostensibly exist to maintain quality standards and provide mutual support for craftsmen. In practice, they function as taxation and market control mechanisms that prevent economic mobility while extracting continuous payments from anyone trying to work. Guild membership requires substantial entry fees, annual due, apprenticeship payments, quality assessment fees, and various ceremonial contributions for guild activities. But the real genius of the guild system is its ability to create artificial scarcity through professional licensing. Guilds limit the number of people allowed to practice each trade, ensuring that demand always exceeds supply while maintaining high prices for guild services. This means that guild members pay taxes for the privilege of operating in a market with restricted competition, while non-guild members are legally prohibited from competing regardless of their skills or customers' preferences. The guild system has managed to create taxation that people pay voluntarily in exchange for protection from market forces that would otherwise benefit consumers. Your attempt to establish yourself in the urban economy reveals another layer of taxation complexity: competing jurisdictions. The town government collects certain taxes. The guild system collects others. The church maintains its tithe obligations regardless of where you live. The king's tax collectors still find you even in town. Your original lord may still claim feudal obligations if you haven't formally purchased your freedom through yet another payment system. This creates situations where the same economic activity generates tax obligations to multiple authorities who don't coordinate their collection efforts or payment schedules. You might sell goods in the market on Monday, triggering stallage and transaction taxes due to the town government. Tuesday, the guild assessor appears, demanding payment for operating without proper licensure. Wednesday brings the church collector seeking tithe on your market income. Thursday, royal agents arrive requiring scutage payments. Friday, your former lord's bailiff shows up, claiming you still owe feudal obligations until you pay a formal liberation fee. The complexity reaches absurd levels when you discover specialty taxes that apply only in specific urban contexts. There's a noise tax for activities that disturb the peace, calculated according to the volume, duration, and time of day of your disturbances. There's a smell tax for businesses that produce odors, including bakeries, breweries, tanneries, and smithies. There's even a crowd tax for activities that attract large numbers of people, regardless of whether those activities benefit the community. These specialty taxes create revenue opportunities from normal urban life while providing authorities with tools for selective enforcement against individuals or businesses they want to discourage. The same activity might generate different tax obligations depending on who's doing it, when they're doing it, and whether tax collectors approve of their purposes. Urban taxation reaches its logical conclusion in the concept of urban air makes free, which sounds liberating until you understand its financial implications. Towns offer legal freedom from feudal obligations in exchange for comprehensive urban tax obligations that often exceed what peasants pay in rural areas. You're trading one form of economic oppression for another, more complex form that offers theoretical mobility at the cost of actual income. The urban tax system creates powerful incentives for geographic arbitrage, where merchants and craftsmen constantly relocate to minimize their tax burdens. Towns compete for residents and businesses by offering temporary tax exemptions, creating a medieval version of corporate tax incentives. But these exemptions are always temporary, designed to attract newcomers who become locked into comprehensive tax obligations once they've established businesses and family relationships. As evening falls and you calculate your first day's tax obligations as an urban resident, the mathematics are enlightening and depressing. You've discovered that town life offers opportunities for higher income, accompanied by proportionally higher taxation. The urban economy generates more wealth, but urban authorities have developed more sophisticated methods for capturing that wealth before it can improve residents' living standards. Tomorrow, you'll learn about additional urban taxes you haven't encountered yet. The window tax, which discourages natural lighting. The door tax, which penalizes architectural convenience. The garden tax, which makes food production expensive. The well tax, which monetizes water access. Urban taxation has achieved something rural taxation only dreamed of: comprehensive monetization of every aspect of human habitat and activity. Tonight, you'll sleep in an urban dwelling where every architectural feature, every piece of furniture, every source of heat and light represents a calculated compromise between functionality and tax minimization. You're learning that medieval towns didn't just offer economic opportunities. They offered opportunities to pay taxes on economic opportunities while paying additional taxes for the infrastructure that makes those opportunities possible. Urban tax nightmares don't end when you fall asleep. They continue in your dreams, where you'll find yourself paying taxes on the sleep you're getting, the dreams you're having, and the energy you're recovering for tomorrow's tax obligations. Welcome to town life, where freedom means the liberty to choose which taxes to pay first. You've now experienced the full spectrum of medieval taxation: the feudal obligations, the church tithes, the royal levies, the urban complexities. You've watched your community's wealth flow steadily upward to support people who produce nothing while consuming everything. You've calculated that somewhere between 70 and 90% of everything you and your neighbors create disappears into various taxation systems. And now you're about to witness what happens when ordinary people finally say no. The breaking point comes, as it often does, with one tax too many. The royal messenger arrives on a Tuesday morning with news that the king requires a poll tax. Not a tax on your property, your production, to your animals, or your activities. A tax on your head, simply for existing. Every person over the age of 14 owes the crown 3 groats, payable immediately, regardless of their ability to work, their health status, their family obligations, or their previous tax payments. This is the moment when medieval tax logic reveals its fundamental absurdity. You've already paid land taxes, labor taxes, production taxes, transaction taxes, religious taxes, and various fees for the privilege of breathing royal air. Now the crown wants to tax the fact that you're alive. The poll tax isn't based on any economic principle or governmental need. It's based on the simple calculation that heads can be counted and counted heads can be taxed. The reaction in your village is immediate and volcanic. Thomas the miller, a man so mild-mannered that he apologizes to his grinding stones when they jam, stands up in the village meeting and says the words that everyone has been thinking but nobody has dared speak enough. His voice doesn't carry the rhetoric of revolution or the language of political theory. It carries something more dangerous, the quiet conviction of someone who has finally reached his limit. When Adam delved and Eve span, who was then the gentleman, this question, posed by the radical priest John Ball, spreads through your community like wildfire. It's not just asking about social hierarchy. It's asking the fundamental question that medieval taxation systems work desperately to suppress. Why should people who work support people who don't work simply because of accidents of birth? You watch as your neighbors transform from individual taxpayers into something the authorities never anticipated, a collective force capable of saying no. This isn't just about the poll tax anymore. It's about the accumulated grievances of generations who've watched their labor disappear into the pockets of people who've never held a plow, planted a seed, or missed a meal. The rebellion begins with tax resistance, but quickly becomes something larger. Wat Tyler, a former tax collector who understands the system's mechanisms better than anyone, emerges as a leader precisely because he knows how the extraction machine operates. There's poetic justice in a tax collector leading a tax revolt. And the irony isn't lost on anyone who's dealt with his former colleagues. What starts in your village spreads to neighboring villages, then to entire counties. The peasants' revolt of 1381 becomes a coordinated uprising that challenges not just specific taxes, but the entire economic system that makes such taxation possible. For the first time in generations, ordinary people are acting on the radical proposition that their labor belongs to them rather than to their social superiors. You join the march to London not because you're particularly brave or politically sophisticated, but because staying home means continuing to pretend that the current system is tolerable. The march itself becomes a tax rebellion in action. peasants refuse to pay road tolls, bridge fees, or market taxes. They're not just protesting taxation, they're demonstrating what life might look like if taxation were voluntary rather than compulsory. The rebels' demands, when they finally meet with King Richard II, reveal how thoroughly medieval taxation has shaped their understanding of social relationships. They don't ask for representation in government or constitutional limits on royal power. They ask for the complete abolition of serfdom, the elimination of feudal obligations, and the establishment of fixed, reasonable rents instead of arbitrary tax assessments. But perhaps most tellingly, they demand that all lands held by the church above what's necessary for the sustenance of the clergy should be divided among the common people. This isn't just about reducing church wealth. It's about recognizing that the tithe system has created a parallel economy where productive land generates income for people who don't work it, while people who do work it can barely survive on what remains. The rebellion's brief success demonstrates both the possibility and the fragility of tax resistance. For a few weeks, large areas of England operate without the normal taxation systems. Markets function without transaction taxes. Roads remain passable without toll collection. Communities organize without feudal obligations. The experiment proves that society can function without the elaborate extraction mechanisms that authorities claim are necessary for civilization. But the system's response reveals why taxation isn't just about revenue generation. It's about power maintenance. The authorities don't just crush the rebellion, they systematically execute its leaders, reimpose the previous tax obligations, and add new penalties specifically designed to prevent future resistance. The message is clear: challenging the tax system means challenging the entire social order. And such challenges will be met with lethal force. The aftermath of the peasants' revolt illustrates the long-term consequences of tax systems that exceed the population's capacity to pay. Economic productivity declines because people lose incentive to work when most of their production will be confiscated. Population decreases as families emigrate to regions with lower tax burdens or simply fail to survive under comprehensive extraction. Social trust erodes as communities turn against each other in competition for tax relief or exemption. You witness the demographic catastrophe that excessive taxation can create. Villages that once supported 50 families now struggle to maintain 20. Fields that once produced surplus crops now barely meet subsistence needs. Markets that once bustled with trade now operate sporadically because merchants can't afford the comprehensive taxation that accompanies commercial activity. The Black Death, which arrives in Europe during the same period as peak taxation, creates a natural experiment in economic relationships. As population decline, labor becomes scarce and valuable. Workers begin demanding higher wages, better working conditions, and reduced tax obligations. For the first time in centuries, ordinary people have bargaining power in their relationships with landlords and authorities. The response reveals how completely the medieval economic system depends on powerless workers. Authorities pass laws freezing wages at pre-plague levels, prohibiting worker mobility, and imposing additional taxes on anyone who tries to improve their economic situation. The Statute of Laborers essentially criminalizes economic mobility, making it illegal for workers to seek better employment or demand fair compensation for their labor. This creates a feedback loop where taxation becomes increasingly oppressive as authorities try to maintain their income levels despite declining population and productivity. Higher taxes drive more people away or into poverty, reducing the tax base and necessitating even higher rates on those who remain. The system begins consuming itself, destroying the very economic activity it depends on for revenue. You observe communities developing sophisticated tax avoidance strategies that amount to parallel economic systems. Barter networks emerge to avoid transaction taxes. Families deliberately keep production below taxable thresholds. Craftsmen work informally to avoid guild taxes. Entire villages relocate to regions with more favorable tax policies. Medieval people prove remarkably creative at finding ways around systems designed to control their economic lives. But perhaps the most significant long-term consequence of the medieval tax crisis is the gradual development of constitutional limits on taxation authority. The repeated failure of comprehensive extraction systems forces authorities to negotiate with subjects rather than simply demanding compliance. The principle that taxation requires consent, even if that consent is given by representatives rather than individuals, emerges from the practical necessity of maintaining systems that people won't simply abandon or revolt against. The English Parliament's gradual assertion of authority over taxation reflects not democratic idealism but practical recognition that sustainable revenue systems require some degree of taxpayer buy-in. The famous principle of no taxation without representation doesn't emerge from abstract political theory. It develops from centuries of experience with taxation systems that collapsed when they exceeded what populations would tolerate. As you reflect on your journey through the medieval tax system, from your first encounter with the bailiff's demands to your participation in revolutionary resistance, you understand that taxation is never just about money. It's about the fundamental relationship between individuals and the authorities who claim power over them. Medieval taxation failed, not because it was inefficient, but because it was too efficient at extracting wealth while providing too little in return. The legacy of medieval taxation systems lives on in modern constitutional protections, legal limits on government authority, and the persistent popular suspicion of tax collectors that characterizes democratic societies. Every limitation on governmental taxation power, every requirement for legislative approval of tax increases, every constitutional protection of property rights exists because previous generations learned through bitter experience. What happens when taxation systems operate without constraints? Tonight, as you drift off to sleep in a world where taxation operates within legal boundaries, where tax rates are subject to democratic control, and where tax collection operates according to established procedures rather than arbitrary authority, you might spare a thought for your medieval ancestors. They paid the price, often literally with their lives, for the constitutional protections that modern taxpayers take for granted. The medieval tax system's ultimate legacy isn't the wealth it extracted or the authorities it supported. It's the hard-learned lesson that sustainable societies require economic relationships based on mutual benefit rather than systematic extraction. When taxation becomes indistinguishable from organized theft, the entire social contract breaks down. And rebuilding requires recognizing that even tax collectors are subject to the rule of law. Sweet dreams of tax codes with constitutional limits, democratic oversight, and legal appeals processes. Your ancestors fought and died so you could complain about the IRS instead of fleeing to the forest to avoid the king's bailiff.